Hi, I'm Marion Larson, and I teach in the English department at Bethel. I teach courses, mostly courses in writing, also in literature, and I'm one of the faculty members that teaches in the humanities program. I can think of a lot of reasons, of course, to use writing in a content area class, and I use a lot of writing in the classes that I teach. Most commonly when writing people answer this question, they use two buzz phrases. One is write to learn, and the other is learn to write. And I guess I'll actually start with the second one, which is the one that I think a lot of people would expect I would say, and that is that the more that students write for varied audiences and in different contexts and receive feedback about that writing, the more likely it is that they'll learn to write better. And I think most faculty are reasonably on board with that idea. I know that some faculty, though, might say, but I'm not an English professor, I'm not a writing professor, I have so many other things I'm trying to do in my class, that's what I need to focus on. So then I would give sort of my second set of answers, which is encapsulated under the buzz phrase, write to learn. And that's the idea that any time a person writes about something, it can help that person to learn the material about which they're writing. To learn that material better, it can help that person or the instructor see where there's maybe gaps in understanding or misunderstanding. So one thing I would say is if we're trying to teach our students content material, having them write about the material can actually help us to accomplish our content goal. And then a nice side benefit is students can learn to write better. I know that a lot of faculty over the years at Bethel have read Ken Bain's book, What the Best College Teachers Do. He doesn't talk directly about writing, but he does talk about 4 areas that the most effective college teachers keep in mind when they're planning a course. And I think really using writing in a class can work effectively with those 4 areas. And those 4 areas are, or I guess the 4 questions that many faculty ask themselves when they're planning a class. One is a goal-oriented question. What should students be able to do as a result of their learning? And I would argue that even if a main goal in my course isn't helping students learn to write better, accomplishing those other goals, writing can assist with that. His second question is, how can I best help them to develop or to gain the skills I want them to have by the end of the course? Writing can certainly be a means toward that end. Thirdly, how can my students and I best understand the nature, quality, and progress of their learning? Having students write over the course of the semester, sometimes small writing assignments or larger ones, can help me get a sense of the progress of their learning and can help give them a sense of the progress of their learning. And then finally, how can I evaluate my own efforts to foster their learning if I am paying more attention to what students are and aren't learning across the semester by looking at the writing that they're doing for me. I might then be able to adjust my own teaching strategies to help them learn that content better. The term process approach to writing has been around, I'd say probably since the 1970s or early 1980s. So I know it's a term that most people have heard. I think the best way I can try to define it is by saying it really has to do with where an instructor's focus is or where an instructor's intervention might lie. The process approach is usually contrasted with what's called a product approach. The product approach is probably what most of us encountered as students, and that is a paper or an exam or some kind of writing exercise was assigned, and then that was turned in on the day it was due, and a grade and maybe comments were provided on that final product. A process approach means that some stages along the way toward that product are not only assigned but are given feedback by the instructor and maybe by peers in the class. I'll give 2 examples to sort of help illustrate this contrast. And maybe one way to think of it is the difference between the instructor being primarily a judge or evaluator as opposed to being, say, a coach. I love watching ice skating when it's on in the Olympics, but I'm a terrible ice skater. And if I decided I wanted to skate better, under a product approach, I might hire a coach who would say, you want to skate better? Okay, go ahead and skate, and I'll tell you that that was terrible. You get a 1 on a scale of 10. Or let's watch all of these videos of really effective skaters. Let's look at the final product, and somehow magically or intuitively you're going to become a better skater. Under a process approach, a coach would say, all right, let's work on little pieces along the way. I'm going to design exercises that will help you learn how to skate forward more effectively, or how to jump more effectively, or how to do little pieces. Maybe another illustration will help. Let's say I want to learn to bake a cake. Under a product approach, I might look at pictures of a cake. I might even eat a cake and say, well, a really good cake has these features. It tastes fluffy. It looks beautiful. It has all of these qualities to it. But that doesn't tell me how I can make a better cake. And under a process approach, I would be receiving I would try it out. I'd try making my own cake. And then I would receive some feedback from a person who knows more about cake baking than I do, who would say, you notice that this cake is a little bit dry. Here's what you need to try in order to make your cake less dry. Or your icing isn't the way you want it to be. Here's what you need to try in order to make it fluffier. As far as how a process approach might be used in content courses, I think rather than an instructor saying, oh my gosh, in addition to teaching all of the content in my course, now you're telling me I need to assign a lot of writing, and you're telling me I'm responsible to help students learn to write better. My response would be to encourage faculty to, just as we try to think of ourselves as learning coaches when it comes to helping our students learn the content in our classes, we also might try to think of ways that we could be writing coaches, and maybe that means I'm only going to focus on one particular thing. We don't need to help produce utterly skilled writers in every possible way by the end of every single course. That partly depends on what book or article I've read recently, because I always like to find new ideas, and I might try an idea for a year or two and then try something else. But here's 2 that I really like right now. I read an article about a year ago written by a philosophy professor who talked about ways in which he's trying to hold his students accountable for thinking carefully about the assigned reading, but to use writing as a tool for that. And then so consequently, I think that this becomes a good right-to-learn exercise. He calls it a QQTP. And the first Q stands for quote, then the second Q stands for question, and the TP stands for talking point. So this is really just a way of structuring an informal written response that he has students do related to every single thing they read for class. So currently, I have students do QQTPs, or as my students fondly now call them, Q-tips. I have them do Q-tips in several of the classes I teach. So they're supposed to, they write about a page this ends up being 4 just about every class period. Here's a quote or 2 that stood out to them from the reading that they were assigned to do for that day. Sometimes I say I want you to pick a quote or 2 that you think is most important or does the best job of encapsulating what this piece is about. Sometimes I simply say you chose a quote that you found interesting or that stood out to you for some reason. And then question is they should write down a question or 2 that the reading raised for them. And one of the things I'm trying to do is helping them learn how to ask good questions about the reading. So I say a good question is not simply, what year did this author write this? Or, what kind of pen did they use? As simply either an unimportant or just a fact-based question that would be easy enough to look up. We spent some time in class, especially early on, talking about what a productive question is, the kind of question where asking it is going to actually encourage further thinking about the text itself, or is maybe going to encourage connections between this text and other ideas we've been considering in class, or maybe between this text and questions that the student is thinking about in his or her own life. And then TP, talking point, is I ask them in a couple of sentences to jot down, okay, if I were to call on you, what's a point you might want to make about this text? Not just a question about it, but does this lead you to express an opinion about it? Or if I were to call on you and say, can you sort of make a little quick mini presentation about today's reading, what's something you might say? And then I say to them, this whole QQTP should be about a page long. So what I'm wanting them to do is to pick maybe the quote or a question or the talking point, pick something that they jotted down, and then elaborate on that a little bit. And then sometimes I'll begin a class period by calling on someone and saying, what's one of the quotes that you wrote down, or about a talking point. Sometimes that doesn't happen, but I'll collect them. We'll talk about them. So that's one right to learn exercise that I like very much and have found a whole bunch of ways to use in class. And then the other, I'm not really sure what to call this, but this is especially helpful, I think, in literature classes or in classes where I want students to sort of get inside the mind or the perspective of an author or a character in a text. So I'll have students write something that's not like an essay, but is more a journal entry or a letter. Write it as if you are this author, or write it as if you are this character, or write a letter from this character to this other character. And so that's trying to accomplish partly the goal of, have you read this and thought about it? But in particular, the goal of, are you developing some possible empathy for this character? Are you learning to think like this character or think like this author? So that's another sort of category of right to learn exercises that I use pretty frequently. There isn't one thing that a good writing assignment has to look like. So I think the way I like to answer this question is to say, here's some things I try to do or try to think about when I'm creating a writing assignment. So I always start by asking myself, what are the goals in this course? Not just the goals in general, but what particular one or two course goals am I trying to help further by having students do this writing assignment in the first place? I don't think that a writing assignment is going to be as successful as I might like if I haven't asked, how is this going to help push students toward accomplishing the course goal? So I always start with that, and often in talking with students about the assignment, or in giving them feedback as they're working on it, or in grading it at the end, I'll often say, remember, one of the goals of this class is X. That's why I'm having you do this assignment, and that's what we're trying to accomplish here. So to connect it with course goals. The other thing I try to do is I try to think through, what problems do I think students are likely to encounter while working on this assignment. And I'll base that partly on past experience with similar assignments, past experience with similar students. So, for example, if it's a large term culminating assignment, like let's say it's a research paper of some kind, I won't ask what's every conceivable problem that every student in the class might have, but I'll ask, given a group of students like this, what are some typical problems that might be encountered? And I might actually write them down, or I'll at least have it in my mind. And then I ask myself, this gets back to the comment I made earlier about the importance of a teacher thinking of herself as being like a coach. So I'll ask, where are students likely to have problems? And then what do I want to do about that? Sometimes the answer might be, I want them to struggle through that problem. Sometimes it'll be, I want to provide them with some possible instruction. Or maybe that's a good time for me to help intervene in the process. But if I'm asking myself, what are my goals? Where might students encounter problems? And then what am I going to do about it? That'll suggest what should this assignment look like? Should there be some process pieces along the way? If so, will peers provide feedback? Will I perhaps meet with students individually in class? Will we talk for 10 minutes in class one day about how to deal with these problems? Then I also work to make sure that assignments have built into them some kind of response and feedback before the final product is evaluated. That's really one way of articulating what a process approach to writing looks like. I rarely will make an assignment and say, hey, by the way, if you'd like to get feedback before the final version is due, you're welcome to do it. If I only do that, I'll get the 2 or 3 people in class who least need the feedback, and the people who most need it will almost certainly not take me up on that. So it gets back to the goals. What are the goals, and then where do I think students are likely to encounter problems, and what do I want to do about it? I think really, again, Bain's four questions come up here. You know, what is the end result going to be? How do I want to help students along the way, and how can I help students be aware of what their progress looks like, and how can I be aware of it too? In determining whether or not a writing assignment has been effective, there's probably 3 questions I usually ask myself. One is, does student performance on this assignment look like I had expected it would look, or look like I had hoped it would look? When I collect a batch of papers, my most common practice is to make a cup of coffee, sit in a comfortable chair, and set a relatively short period of time in which to really quickly skim through the whole batch. I kind of want to get a sense of what does the territory look like here. In the long run, that can save me a lot of time if across-the-board performance is so dramatically worse than I was expecting, and if it's really important for students to do well on this task, I might decide to treat what I had thought was a final draft as a rough draft, provide some additional instruction in class, and give students one more shot at improving it. At any rate, it gives me a sense of how did this particular group of students perform on this task. So so I'll ask myself that question, and if it's, like I said before, if it's much worse or about what I was expecting, that tells me something about whether it was an effectively crafted assignment. Secondly, I ask, did students' work on this assignment seem to reinforce an important course concept? Especially if it's a content area course. If I look at not just how well written is this, but what about students' levels of understanding of the material? Does it seem like producing this helped to accomplish some of the goals that I had in mind, both for course concepts and for their writing? And then thirdly, I ask myself, is the energy that students put into this task, does it seem like it was worthwhile energy? Was it worthwhile for them, and was it worthwhile for me? I might decide at the end, yeah, students performed well on this. I'm given a lot of A's and B's. It seems like they did well, but I might conclude ultimately that it wasn't a good assignment because they uniformly reported that they put a lot of energy into it that really didn't seem to engage them, or didn't seem to help them accomplish other goals, or maybe I put so much energy into it that I know that this is something I can't possibly sustain later, and that really the final product looks super good because I did it. and so in my mind, that's also not a very successful writing assignment. In terms of sort of an example of an effective and an ineffective writing assignment, I mentioned earlier the QQTP. So this was an idea that I got from someone else. And I was really excited about it. I very commonly in content area classes, rather than giving reading quizzes, I like to give some kind of regular writing prompt that has students, usually before class or sometimes at the beginning of class, writing about what they've read, partly as a way of holding them accountable for that reading. So I thought QQTP will be my new magic bullet and it'll work well. The first semester I used them, I think it worked great for a small percentage of students, most of whom were probably already reading carefully to begin with. And I realized that the problem was I hadn't said, I really want you to fill about a page, or I want you to elaborate a little bit. I hadn't said, in choosing a quote or two, pick one that strikes you as important. And so what ended up happening was I had too many students who would maybe, it would appear, randomly choose a quote, or choose a quote from the very first page of the reading or the last page of the reading. You know, the different things that students sometimes will do to psych us out. So the second time around, I decided I'm going to push them to, I asked what did the good QQTPs look like from the students who were really engaged, and I built that into the way I framed the assignment. So I said, I want you to pick good and representative quotes. I want you to ask good questions, and I'll probably need to spend time in class helping them learn what it means to ask a good question. And I want you to elaborate a bit on why you said what you did. I also realized that for something like a QQTP to work well, I had to be willing to be committed to giving students very quick turnaround on those, because they're writing them for me virtually every class period. And I hadn't been as good about giving them regular feedback the first time I did that assignment as the second one. So that's not so much a difference between an effective or an ineffective assignment, but it was an effective or ineffective use of an assignment. There's so many things that I could say in answering this question. I will just touch on a couple of things. One is I would really, really encourage faculty, no matter what your discipline, don't be afraid to have students write. If you currently are teaching a class where students maybe don't write for you at all, or maybe they're only writing, say, an essay response on a midterm. So let's say they're doing a small amount of writing or none. Don't feel like you need to jump from that into every day my students are going to be doing something like a QQTP and they're going to be doing a research paper. Don't feel like you need to totally redo that, but ask, what's at least one goal in my course, content goal, that might conceivably be enhanced if I had students do some writing about it. So that'd be one piece of advice. Just do a little bit more writing than you're doing right now. If you're already having your students do a lot of writing, then I would ask that faculty consider how much energy they're putting now into responding and grading. And usually that energy comes when we collect final drafts and we then build up all this resentment towards students because you know how this drill goes. It's final exam week. I can't wait for the term to be over. And I'm spending a half hour or an hour or whatever per paper making all of these copious comments. And I know that most of my students won't even pick up this final paper. So what I would encourage faculty who already assign writing to do is to take the amount of time you now spend grading a final draft of something and reallocate that time differently over the course of the semester. If I put 15 minutes or 20 minutes into providing some comments on a student draft, and then students revise that paper, then number one, I'm going to feel better about the papers I get because they're going to be turning in better papers for me. They'll probably feel better about it. I expect they will have learned the content and will have learned something about how to write. It also won't take me quite as long to grade that final paper because I've seen a previous version of it. So I read an article once that talked about interventional interaction. And this author said that we all as faculty have interaction with students about their work, but if we could learn to make that interaction occur at times where our intervention is likely to do the most good, that can be helpful as well. If I go back to the coaching metaphor, I think a good coach looks at a performer, especially if that performer is not very skilled yet, and tries to focus on maybe the one thing or the two things that that person might conceivably be able to work on right now, or that would make the most difference. So I guess that would be my other piece of advice. Instead of saying, okay, I want to be really diligent now as a teacher, and I'm going to comment on every problem I see in every student paper, not only will that make you crazy because there's no way you'll have time to do it, it actually can be counterproductive for students, especially for less skilled writers, to receive too much feedback. So assign a little bit of writing. If you're already assigning writing, try to really think about when your intervention would do the most good. And then when you do provide intervention, try to be really targeted in your comments. It's okay to fail to comment on something like a misplaced comma when a paper really needs help with focus or with organization. And again, I guess I would say I wish Ken Bain would give me money for always mentioning him, but I think Ken Bain's comments are really helpful here as well, to ask, what do you want students to be able to do? How can you help them reach that goal? How can you make them aware of their progress? And then what are you learning that might help you to teach them better? The clip that you're about to see comes from a class I'm teaching this semester, essay writing. This is a mostly sophomore, junior level class. Most of the students in the class are some version of an English major, although there are students from education, from pre-med, and some other areas who choose to take this as a reasonable follow-up to college writing. In this particular course, students write very regularly. They write rough drafts, and they receive feedback from me and also feedback from each other. And I tell them that peer conferencing is a really important part of this particular class. I want them to learn how to become better at looking at a piece of writing that needs work and figuring out how to be really specific about saying, here's what's working and here's what's not working. And I tell them that that can be a useful skill for them to turn back on their own writing, as well as for the students in the class who are maybe going to become teachers one day. So in this particular class, this was the very first day we were about to be doing some peer conferencing. This is the first day they were turning in a weekly draft of their work. I'm assuming that most of them are not going to be very good at giving this kind of feedback, and I'm assuming a lot of them will have had negative experiences as members of peer conference groups in the past. So what I do in this class is about 3 times early in the semester, and what you're seeing here is the first time I've done this. I bring in a draft of a paper that's like the one they're working on, and I make it either something that I wrote myself and either deliberately made it semi-problematic, or at least I wrote under such dramatically constricted time constraints that it's going to be a paper with flaws, or maybe it'll be a sample student paper without a name on it from a previous semester. At any rate, it gives us something to look at. And then I say, I'm going to try to walk us through the same process you'll be using in a few minutes with each other's papers. So for today, I think it's most useful if you kind of try to start with the big picture, and I think big picture is things like, does this have either a main point or some kind of a sense of focus to it? What about ideas about structure? Kind of the sort of thing that you'd notice hearing it read out loud once, or if you were reading it on your own, the kind of things you'd notice if you were reading pretty quickly. And now I'm going to invoke Donald Murray again. I told you guys I would do this a bunch. One of the things Donald Murray talks about in both drafting and revising is figuring out what's an appropriate speed for you as a writer, or in this case, for you as a reader. And he says you need to learn how to write with velocity. And he says that in drafting, making yourself kind of plow ahead and be fast is more useful than drafting so slowly that you get hung up on a particular word or sentence. And the same is true for you as a reader of someone else's work or of your own work. If you read something through pretty quickly you're more likely to notice big picture stuff, and you might not notice, is this comma in the right place, or was this the best word? And that's a good thing, because if you give too many editorial comments to each other at this stage, you might be helping to fix a sentence that's going to drop out of the final draft anyway. So I would say, in general, don't make these, especially these early conferences, times to make editing kinds of comments. I would say the one exception would be, even in a first draft, if you notice from a group member that this person is persistently making the same mistake, and you feel pretty well equipped to explain and help clarify, maybe it's misuse of apostrophes or something like that, and you're really good at explaining that, then that'd be okay. But in general, this would be a good time not to comment on editorial things. Focusing on just a couple things at a time is more useful than trying to comment on absolutely everything that you notice. And I'll be trying to do this in my comments on your drafts also. So when I make comments either orally or in writing on these first drafts, I'll deliberately not comment on absolutely everything that occurs to me. I'll try to focus on the top, maybe 2 or 3 things that if you were to work more with this draft, what seems like you get the most bang for your buck in terms of working on it. Being really specific is useful. So saying something like, it doesn't flow, trying to think of the most common sentences that come out of people's mouths. It doesn't flow. It seems a little choppy. I really like your idea. I mean, those are okay places to start. But see if you can, do your best to try to explain why you think that is. And if you can offer a concrete idea, I think that would be good practice for you as a writer, but also helpful for the others. So here's the process that I'd like you to follow for these first conferences, and then once we get going, you guys are certainly free to adjust this a little bit. Especially these early drafts, they're likely to be short enough that I think we will have time for the writer to actually read the draft out loud while group members listen. So, but before reading it out loud, the writer gets a chance to say a sentence or two. It could be by way of apology. I was up really late last night. This is the worst thing I've ever written. Whatever it is you feel you need to say to make yourself feel better before anybody reads your draft. Maybe you actually like your draft pretty well, and you want to target your readers toward giving you a certain kind of feedback. You could say that too. Then read it out loud. And these are the bullets on your half-page handout at the bottom. Group members give oral feedback while the writer takes notes or asks questions, just to make sure that you as the writer understand the feedback you're getting. You can decide later what you want to do with it. And I think it's useful for group members to start by making comments about things you think are working pretty well in the draft so far, or things that have potential to be strong. Kind of, leading with the, here's what I like about this paper, or here's what I think could be strong with a little bit of work. And then moving towards what's maybe not working as well right now. Things that were confusing or could use more details, that sort of thing. Try to end your conference time with a couple of suggestions for revision. And I already mentioned that last comment about trying to avoid editing and comments about mechanics. I think the hardest thing to learn is how to balance being both useful in your feedback and encouraging at the same time. And so that's one thing that I'll try to model for you in the comments I give you, and something that I hope that you all can sort of learn a little bit as we go. Do you have questions at this point? All right. So let's look at this particular draft. Wow. I wrote this draft a long time ago when I used to teach college writing on a more regular basis. And I don't think I had assigned everybody to write about a family tradition, but I had suggested that as a possibility. So that was kind of the focus of the essay. One thing that I think will be really, really obvious to you as I start reading this is that although I have details about what some of my husband's family Christmas traditions are, this paper doesn't go anywhere and it's not very interesting. So that's the kind of feedback that would be most useful. All right, so I will read it, and as I'm reading, just sort of make a little note to yourself really quickly so that when we talk about it, you'll remember what it is you were hoping to say. Lots of families have traditions that surround the way they celebrate holidays. It's these traditions that make the holidays more meaningful because it gives you something to look forward to each year. The traditions may take lots of work to maintain, or they may get boring sometimes, but it's worth it. My family's tradition at Christmas is to do something different each year, if you can call that a tradition. Sometimes we open presents on Christmas Eve, sometimes on Christmas morning. My mom cooks a big turkey dinner one year, and we eat out with friends the next. Our grandmother joins us one year, and it's just us the next. I like the flexibility of this arrangement, but sometimes Christmas is a bit of a letdown if you don't plan for it. That's why I like the way my husband's family celebrates Christmas. We do the same things every year without fail. We work hard to prepare by cooking, shopping, eating, and planning, but that's part of the fun. Let me tell you a little about their Christmas traditions so you can see what I mean. It begins several weeks before Christmas when Dave's mom starts cooking and then freezing the holiday goodies. She always makes several kinds of cookies, lots of lefse meatballs, and Chex party mix. Dave's grandmother is in the Christmas pudding and rosettes department, a job she fulfills quite well. His dad fights the crowds at Ingebrigtsen's Deli in South Minneapolis, emerging with several pounds of potato sausage. Getting closer to the big day, Christmas itself, we always spend Christmas Eve with Dave's grandmother, his mom's mom, in Medina. There we have the same menu each year: pork roast, lutefisk for the brave or very stupid, potatoes, lefse root beer, and Christmas pudding with rich white sauce. Each year we vow not to eat so much the next year, but when that year rolls around, we eat until we feel sick once again. That's part of what Christmas means, I guess. After dinner, we sit around and relax. Dave's dad, who's quite bald, has recently begun a tradition of putting stupid things on his head for our amusement, posing for pictures this way. He's worn stick-on Christmas ribbons, a Christmas napkin, and a cardboard cone Christmas tree with tinsel all over it. One of these days, we'll be able to put together a photo album of just these shots. Finally comes Christmas Day itself. We all arrive at Dave's parents' house early, around 8 a.m., and drink coffee while staring greedily at our gifts. When we all arrive, there will be 3 grandparents, 4 cousins, 3 brothers, a sister, a couple of grandkids, and 2 kids-in-law. One is me. This makes for a crowded room and many presents. It means, of course, that the cooks, the women, of course, stay busy, but we have fun anyway. The main order of the day is the present opening, an event that proceeds the same way each year. We each collect our gifts, putting our haul in a pile around us. Then one person opens their gifts while everyone else watches and takes pictures. This makes for a long process, like 3 hours or so, but it makes the day feel fun and special. During the opening, we continue to eat, of course, an activity that seems to go on without end from Christmas Eve through New Year's Day, and we take pictures. My favorite is of Dave's large Swedish grandmother with a Cheerios t-shirt, her newest gift, on over her dress, sweater, and large Swedish farm grandmother bosoms. After opening the gifts and filling several garbage bags with the ripped-up wrapping paper, it's time for Christmas dinner. As with Christmas Eve dinner, there are lots of Scandinavian goodies, but we add pot roast, rolls, regular vegetables, Jello salad, and several kinds of pies and cakes. Before we eat, the big holiday tradition is to take a photo of all of us seated around the dinner table. Every single year, Dave's mom or dad takes a picture of us, and each year we're seated in exactly the same place. It may get old, but it's fun to look at old photo albums and see what we each looked like a couple of years ago. I guess the main thing I'm trying to say is that those traditions, like the way you spend Christmas, mean a lot to those celebrating and planning for them. They may take work, but it's worth it. When we have kids, I think we'll try to have traditions that they can write about when they're in college. And wow, that's the most boring paper you have ever heard. So if I were to work more on this paper, well, I guess we could start with what did you like about this current draft, or what do you think, if I worked on it more, would have potential? Nick?
I guess I liked it. It seemed pretty informal and conversational. Like it's something you would say when talking to somebody if they ask about your Christmas traditions.
Okay.
So I guess for this type of your topic, I think that works well.
Okay. So you felt like the voice and the topic seemed to kind of fit?
Yeah.
Okay. Other either positive or it has potential kinds of comments?
I also liked how there's quite a few times where you use lists in this, where you have this, all separated by comments, which is interesting because around Christmas time, it's a little bit chaotic and there's lists everywhere of what you have to buy, different foods you're going to make. So I think it kind of fit well.
It's so perfect that I think this will work. I think there's 15 people here today, if I'm counting correctly. Yes. I was hoping that would work out because I think groups of 3 in terms of time would work perfectly. For the first couple of times we do this, I'll try to have groups of 3 work, and you guys can group yourselves, but make sure that over the first couple of weeks you're deliberately mixing up your groups a little bit so you can get some different feedback. I asked you to bring 2 copies of your draft essay with you today, and the one that I would like to receive is actually the one that has some comments on it, because it helps me to see what your group members said. I might, in my comments, say, I absolutely agree, or I might say, I don't know, maybe there's a different way to think about it. So, like, that's on your paper, your 2 group members can share by looking at one copy, you can be reading from the other one, and you can take notes while they're giving you feedback, and then that's the copy of it.
So another thing, with her voice too, like right after that, you say it talks to myself a little bit. I just imagine a very
Well, I was just thinking, this was a class session that occurred the very first day of the second week of class. So early on, students didn't know each other very, very well yet. And what worked well is that students were engaged with the exercise. This was the very first day that they brought draft essays into class, and so they hadn't had an experience in this class yet of seeing each other's work or of giving feedback. So they were paying good attention and trying to be careful with what they said to each other, trying to listen carefully when the author of a piece was reading it out loud. So I think that was the positive part. In the first half of the class period, we had looked at a sample essay that I brought, and I had given them some guidelines about how to make comments. And I think what was helpful also is that was fresh in their mind when they were then giving comments to each other. What didn't work so well is they're still really early in the process of learning how to give each other good feedback. Some students naturally do that well, or have maybe had good training in the past, and others haven't developed an eye for what good writing looks like. Maybe they have a sense of what's working and what doesn't, but they don't have a good way of articulating that in a way that might be helpful. So the part that maybe didn't work so well is actually what I would have expected wouldn't work very well early in the semester, is that some of them gave helpful feedback to each other and some didn't. I think definitely peer review can work effectively in content classes. I think the biggest piece of advice I would give about how to do that is the advice I would give about how to use writing at all in a class. And that is to ask, what are the main goals of the course? Why am I having students write in this class at all? And then also to ask, what kind of feedback do students tend to be pretty good at giving each other, and what kind of feedback do they tend not to be very good at giving each other? So I ask myself that question. I ask myself also, how important is this particular paper? How much class time do we have? I know that I can help students learn to give better feedback if I help to train them in how to do it, but that also takes class time. So if I'm teaching a content class and we've got a little bit more time pressure for getting through things, I'll sometimes ask myself, what kind of conversations might students have together, not only about a written piece that they're working on, but also about the content of that piece? What kind of conversations might help them write better papers, but also might help them learn the content better? So sometimes I'll have them give each other feedback just on their very initial idea for a topic, or on maybe on a possible main point or a possible introductory paragraph. If they're all writing about the same material, maybe they've read a chapter from a textbook or they've read some articles and they're all going to be writing about it. Rather than conferencing on the papers they wrote, sometimes I'll have them spend a lot of time talking about the material that they're going to be writing about. And then I can eavesdrop and hear where are they understanding the material or not understanding the material. If they seem to get it, then their papers tend to be better. I've also noticed that some students who don't write very well are not too bad at articulating their views orally, and sometimes just giving them a space in class to say their ideas out loud to each other while a partner or a couple of group members take notes while that person is writing. That can be another way that peers can be useful for each other. So I guess I'll ask questions like, how much class time do we have? What am I trying to accomplish with this assignment? What kind of content material I'm hoping to reinforce by having students do the assignment, and then that'll help me determine how to structure it. If I do decide to have them actually read each other's drafts and comment on them, one of the issues is how long is the paper they're working on. In the class that you taped, they're writing fairly short personal essays, about 3 pages long, and in that kind of a setting, it works pretty well for students to read their essay out loud in class while somebody listens and then gives feedback. But if students are writing longer papers, say 4 or 5 pages or longer, nobody wants to sit and listen to a long paper being read out loud, and there probably isn't time for that. So in those kind of situations, I'll usually give them some guidance about how to give each other comments. I'll tell them how many copies they should bring to a given class period. I'll put them in groups and have them exchange. And then for homework, what they're supposed to do is read over those drafts, provide some written feedback before the next class period. And then we might devote a little bit of class time that next day for them face-to-face to give each other some feedback based on the work they've done outside of class. I think the best way to answer that question is there's sort of a series of assertions, I guess, that I would want to make about things that are worth thinking about before you respond to or evaluate student writing. I think the biggest thing that I try to pay attention to is if students are writing anything for me, I try to think of it as a genuine piece of communication from a real person who's trying to articulate an idea, and I'm a real person trying to understand that idea and trying to help the student figure out how to articulate that idea in a more clear way. That may sound like an obvious or odd thing to say, but I think sometimes when we read student papers, especially if we're grading them, we partly emulate the voice that's in our head from past English teachers we've had before, or maybe a bad experience we had in grad school, or we imagine how colleagues might comment on a paper, or how an English teacher is supposed to do it, and we kind of psych ourselves out and end up not being very helpful. Sometimes we think I've got to be the upholder of standards, and we end up at times having attitudes that are maybe not very productive. Everything that I've ever read about how to provide helpful comments on student work and how to grade student work effectively suggests that if we take students seriously as learners and as people trying to articulate, they're more likely to be motivated to do their best work, and if we make comments accordingly, we're more likely to be making helpful comments. So in general, even if I'm grading a final draft, I still try to think of myself more as a coach than as a judge, even if I'm the person assessing the work. Another thing I try to keep in mind is, what are the goals of this course? What is important to have? What do I want to see students accomplish in this particular assignment? The other things I keep in mind are, when in the semester is this piece of written work being done? Are these students first-year students? Are they seniors? How difficult was the material I'm asking them to write about? So I'm trying to pay attention to all of those contextual factors in determining what might an A, a B, or a C, or lower look like on a given assignment. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the goals, thinking about what different levels of performance would look like on a given assignment before I then go into grading it or responding to it. I guess another comment I would make is I usually make a distinction between responding and evaluating, and I try as much as possible to comment minimally on work that I'm evaluating. So on work that's going to be receiving a letter grade or a number grade, I tend to write very few comments there, and I tend to put most of my energy into commenting on work that students can still revise. And so I'm trying to, in general, provide more response and less evaluation. I guess another piece of advice I would give is you as the instructor can decide if something is actually a final draft or is a rough draft. I've had a few experiences when I had students turn in what I thought would be a final draft, and I expected that what I was doing was sitting down to grade those papers, and after looking through the batch, I decided it really is important that students learn how to do this particular kind of paper, or it's important that they understand the material I ask them to write about. I may treat those as drafts and give the whole class some comments and a little bit more time in order to work on that paper later. There's no rule that says that we can't make that kind of adjustment if we think it's going to improve student learning and ultimately improve their writing. Sometimes when I'm assessing student writing, I try to take on the role of an audience that I have specified for the assignment. So perhaps if I'm teaching a group of students who are going to be teachers themselves someday, I might frame an assignment and say, write this as if you were communicating to parents, or write this as if you were communicating to your principal, provide some kind of rhetorical situation for the assignment. If I've done that for an assignment, I try as best I can to put myself in the shoes of that kind of a reader and to comment accordingly. And when I'm assessing student work, the other thing I try to pay attention to is both how does this piece of writing seem to work as a whole, and how do its component parts work. It happens every once in a while that a piece as a whole is interesting and actually fairly effective, but there might be component parts to it that aren't very effective. The student might not have the periods and the commas in the right place with the documentation system I'm asking them to use, for example. So I try to make sure that whatever grading system I've set up, that I don't put so many points into certain component parts that I end up with a grade that doesn't seem to match my assessment of the piece as a whole. My written feedback depends quite a bit on a variety of factors. Sometimes it's what do I know about this particular student. If it's a class where students are doing a lot of writing for me and it's late in the semester and I know this is a weak writer who struggles in a whole bunch of areas, I might focus in particular on being as encouraging as I can about improvement that I've seen, or maybe targeting one or two areas for improvement. So it'll depend on how well do I know the student, when in the term it is. It also depends on where in the process of working on a paper it is. If a student has turned in a rough draft and the final draft is maybe due a week or two later, I tend to comment on primarily things like main point and organization, sort of big picture ideas. The main thing I try to pay attention to, I guess the two things I try to pay attention to are how are my comments going to send a message to this student about what effective revision looks like. And most students aren't very good at revising. They tend to pick small local issues like, oh, I see I missed an apostrophe, or oops, I misspelled that word. They tend to pick things like that, and they tend to be far less likely to maybe remove a whole paragraph or move a paragraph from page 3 onto page 1 to do those big kinds of global revisions. And so I try, especially with an early draft, not to make many comments on small details, partly because I don't want to send the message to a student that a good way to improve this paper would simply be to fix a couple of small mechanical issues. So on an early draft, I try to focus primarily on here's what I think the main point you're trying to make in this paper is. In fact, my very first line of a comment is usually something like that. Your main point seems to be this. Or I might underline a sentence that sounds like it's probably a thesis. And then I'll say your main point seems to be this. here's what you seem to be saying in your paper that reinforces this main point or helps to support it. Often in first drafts, my comments will stop there because with many students, clarity of main point on an early draft just isn't there yet. Many people, this is certainly not a bad thing, many people use writing as a way of moving towards clarity of thinking. So I've come to expect that when I see a rough draft. If the main point is clear, even on a rough draft, I might then move on to commenting on organization and support, and then finally move to issues like style and mechanics. But I'm trying to send a message to students that there is definitely a hierarchy of concerns, and it makes sense to attend to some issues before paying attention to others. I've also noticed that mechanical and style issues tend to get better even without my comments if most of my comments are focused on here's what I think you're trying to say, and here's how you might say it better. Just students, when they gain greater clarity about what it is they're trying to say, often some of those mechanical things improve sort of magically on their own. I have, I think, about 15 ideas for that one, but I'll just give a couple of them. I often will ask myself, when do I think students would benefit the most from my intervention in their process of working on a given assignment? I know that I could help any student end up with a paper that is significantly better than it would be without any intervention at all. And obviously it's possible to go so far that it becomes my paper rather than the student's. Most of us don't have to worry about that because I think most of us wouldn't have enough time to provide that much intervention. But let's say I'm having students do a research paper, for example. Sometimes I'll decide, often if students get off to a bad start with choosing a good topic or finding good sources, then they're sunk. So sometimes I'll decide that's where I'm going to expend most of my intervention energy is with those very early stages. And I then might decide to have them go to the writing center or to give each other some peer feedback on a draft of the paper itself. So I guess one piece of advice would be to say, don't feel that you need to intervene and give feedback at every single stage of a project that a student is working on. But maybe ask what's one point of reasonable intervention, or possibly two, depends on the size of the assignment and how many students in the class. So sometimes giving students feedback about topic and source selection, maybe about a possible outline or a possible main point of an essay and discussing it, that can be helpful. And that tends to be not a big time commitment on my part. I found that a 15-minute one-on-one discussion with a student can accomplish a lot, requires no outside prep on my part. It gets students into my office and helps to develop a relationship for learning that might be productive later. One thing that I virtually always do in any assignment students turn in is if I decide to collect drafts from a group of students, I usually skim through the whole pile before I write any comments at all. It might sound like that's adding an extra step, but that actually can save me a lot of time, because invariably there will be many people in the class who are struggling with the same issue. And so rather than writing the same comment over and over and over again on 25 or 30 papers, if I notice, for example, that documentation is a problem, or that there are a couple of mechanical issues that are recurring with this particular group of students, I can create a handout that I then give to the whole class and say, maybe you didn't quite understand the difference between quotation and paraphrase if you're using a source. So I might make a handout, I might devote 10 or 15 minutes of class time afterwards and give whole class or large group feedback on some issues. Then I'm not having to write those comments over and over again. I'm becoming a big fan of the one-on-one conference with students for draft feedback also. especially for short, I would say especially for papers up to about 5 pages long. I have found that if I literally take about 2 minutes to skim through a paper before the student comes in to talk to me, I can come up with at least a couple of useful comments to make to that student. And it's taking me far less time than it would to write a lot of written comments. It might sound like I'm kind of slacking off in that regard, but actually reading through something quickly makes it more likely that those big picture, primary order concern issues like main point will stand out. I would say with maybe a third of my students, especially early in the semester on a draft, if I collect a draft, read through it quickly, and decide to conference individually with each student, probably a third of those students really need to just talk through their ideas and to have me take notes while they talk. And I will sometimes say, I'm glad you wrote this draft because I see that by the end of your draft, you've kind of gotten pretty close to stating what your main point is likely to be. You're not quite supporting it yet. Why don't you talk about how you think you might support your point, and I'll take notes while you're talking. And often by the end of a 15-minute conversation, I will have helped a student kind of sketch out maybe what a rough outline might look like, or I might have helped to point out parts of the draft that can give them a starting point then for their next stage. When I do that sort of thing, I don't make it optional, though. I have found that making draft feedback, whether it's meeting with me one-on-one or in writing, making it optional means the people who least need the help are going to be the ones who get it, and the others won't. So skimming through a whole pile in order to get the sense of the issues that the class is facing, that can be useful. Sometimes I'll discuss samples with a whole class. So let's say I've read through a whole pile of papers and I've noticed a clear main point is really a problem. Without putting names on them, I might pick a couple of sample intro paragraphs or sample thesis statements from a few papers that this class wrote. And I'll say, what I usually don't do, I don't usually say, here are 3 or 4 really good ones, voila, magically now the rest of you can do it. I'll usually say, here's a couple that have a good start, but let's talk a little bit about what it might take to turn this into a more effective statement of a main point or a more effective intro. And we'll kind of work together as a class on trying to turn what is now a not very clear thesis statement into a stronger one, or what is maybe clear enough but could be stated better into a stronger one. It certainly benefits the person who wrote that thesis statement, but it gives everybody else in the room some ideas of things that they might try. So when I say, yes, I give feedback to all of my students at some point in the process on every piece of writing they do for me, it doesn't mean I'm commenting on every single thing I notice about every single draft. It really, really is important for students to get feedback quickly in order for the learning to mean anything to them. And so I sometimes I'll even say, I think that's the most important thing I could be doing with this class right now. So I might cancel a class period and meet with students individually instead. Or I might cancel part of a class period or save a little bit of time in terms of my own preparation for class and put that energy instead into giving them feedback. So I guess it really is asking, what is the most productive way I could be expending my teaching energy right now? If I think it's in giving feedback to students, then what's a way I could make that feedback helpful without being so time intensive for me that I can't possibly maintain it? When I was in grad school and then in my first year of teaching, I think really every single year that I've been teaching, someone has asked me the question, do you think student writing is getting worse? And actually, most people don't ask the question. Most people make the assertion, assuming that, of course, I'll agree. I can't give you this quote right now, but I have read several quotes from Harvard professors from the late 1800s on into 1900 bemoaning the fact that so many Harvard students at that time, in their view, could not write at all. So this is, my point is, this is not a new concern, and this is not a concern only at places like Bethel. I do think that over the time that I've been teaching, that students do seem to have increasing difficulty writing an extended argument, maintaining a longer paper, or using an extended argument effectively, because it's so much easier to find many sources than the whole issue of selecting appropriate sources and using them well is perhaps more of a problem than it used to be. Now, of course, the fact that sources are easy to find means that good sources are easier to find and access now than they used to be. I think it's probably demonstrably true that students do less writing in high school now than they did even 15 or 20 years ago. And of the writing that they do, they're probably receiving less feedback from teachers because class sizes are bigger in most school districts in the area, and teachers are under a lot more pressure to help prepare students for particular objective tests. And that tends not to be an ideal environment for helping students learn to write well. I have to say, though, in general, I don't think that as a group students are any better or worse as writers than they were when I started teaching. My first comment would be make sure that the writing that you assign, the comments you provide, and the evaluation that you do is always connected very specifically with the learning goals in the course. Secondly, I think this is especially the case for faculty from disciplines other than English or maybe other than the humanities. If you yourself feel like, oh my goodness, how can I be an effective coach or evaluator of student writing, my advice to you would be focus in particular on writing issues that you do feel comfortable talking with students about. And especially writing issues that are important for people in your particular discipline. And if that's what you're focusing on, perhaps to the exclusion of everything else, students will have gained some additional instruction and practice in those areas in your class. Just as I can't possibly hope to help my students learn everything about all the content I teach in one semester, so too, we can't hope to solve all writing problems in one semester. So focusing on one issue or one small set of issues all by itself would be a great place to start. I would really encourage faculty to require some kind of in-process work from students that receive some kind of feedback from you, whether it's your written comments on a complete draft, individual conferences, oral comments that you provide to the class as a whole based on a group of drafts that you've looked at, peer conferencing, some combination of the above, but some kind of very particular feedback that students can use and practice on as they then revise. Really is a good expenditure of your teaching energy. When you do give comments, don't comment on everything. It'll take too much time, it'll make you crazy, and it is actually potentially demoralizing, especially for the weaker students in your class. So comment on the really big, important issues, primarily around main point, structure, and clarity. That's the big stuff to focus on. If you have concerns about mechanical issues, working individually with some students, perhaps having them do some work in the Writing Center can be two things that you might try to help in that area. And finally, do be sure to get feedback of some kind to students very quickly. If it means setting some other instructional work aside temporarily, I think that is a trade-off very much worth making.